Good afternoon. This is an interesting conversation, and this panel is going to really follow up on a lot of what the first panel talked about, and that is the role of local leaders in the census count. But I will tell you, just imagine that every day, local mayors, council members, aldermen, from this day on, they're hearing a clock in their head saying tick-tock every day, because it's a year from now that is probably one of the most important days in the day and life of a city leader. Because if you think about it, the census is about this distribution of $800 billion of federal funding. The census is about being able to really create a sense of pride for every person that lives in that community, because they really do want to be counted as an American. The census is about resources, that you're being able to serve the right population at the right time with the right amount of money. So let me tell you, Amy, look, this is an important discussion today, providing information. And the National League of Cities Institute appreciates Brookings being able to start this conversation, that the panelists here are going to make it exciting, inspiring, and everybody here is going to go back to your hometowns and your cities and villages and go to City Hall and ask, what are you doing? That's what we want to achieve here today, not just a great conversation. We want to see action out of this group of leaders that's in America. So local leaders are consumed every day by this concept of what impact what role they play in the census. So Beth, I'm going to start with you. Let me just introduce you briefly. Everyone has your bio, but Beth Link, who is the director of the Census Counts campaign at the Leadership Conference. And also we have Gary Bass, who is the executive director of the Bauman Foundation. Unfortunately, Joe Salvo is in the airport right now. But I've heard, Joe is our demographer. And believe me, when I first sat in the audience and they said, we're going to hear from a demographer, I said, oh, God, it's going to be a long dinner. He was amazing. He really was amazing. So we got a great panel here today, but I am going to start with you, Beth. Census Counts campaign is a national hub for, I consider, resources that help people deal with prevent undercounting. So if you were a mayor, a council member, a local leader, what would you be looking for from Census Count campaign from you as a resource?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much to Brookings and to the National League of Cities for putting on this important conversation. You're right. The Census Counts campaign is a collaborative effort of our 15 and growing national partners who represent organizations or represent communities from the Arab American community to the Asian American and Pacific Islander community to the Latino community, but also are speaking to specific community members where they are. So, for example, we work with Faith and Public Life on faith outreach, et cetera. And so the effort is really focused on ensuring that hard-to-count communities, those communities that are traditionally harder to count, are included in the 2020 census. Clarence, I think you were spot on in terms of the impact to cities can really not be overstated. I know I was reading about some of the undercount that happened in Phoenix, Arizona, my hometown, town, and the mayor in that city estimated that the potential losses in that city were in the tens of millions of dollars, and that was probably an underestimate because of because those people were just missing, and it was hard to capture that. It was primarily based off of an undercount of the Hispanic population. So I think if I can just paint a very fine line, that it is really critical, and we have a really incredible, timely opportunity to educate our communities about the importance of the census now. And so that would be the first thing that mayors and council members can do, is educate their communities. The census, the short form, comes around once every 10 years, and so it's not top of mind for many people. Usually you kind of ask a room, do you remember filling out your census 10 years ago? And it's usually pretty mixed. And so that education piece is really, really critical. The second thing I would say is you can also work to set up a complete count committee or commission in your state or in your city if you haven't done so already. We're seeing some cities that are partnering with their counties to set up complete count commissions, or some that do it in coordination with the state. But there are a number of different ways to do it, and of course recommend that funding that complete count commission as a part of that establishment is a best practice. And then the third thing I would say is that the Census Bureau will hire 500,000 people over the course of the census, and so if you have an opportunity to encourage your community members to get hired and empower them and provide those resources, do so. We know that, as the previous panel said, we know that having enumerators or partnership specialists that actually represent the community cannot be overstated. So work with your partners in your state and in your community to set up hiring fairs or education efforts. The last thing I'll say that will be coming up in the next couple of months is that the Census Bureau is establishing questionnaire assistance centers, which will basically be places that people can get help to fill out their census form. Work with your community partners in your community to make sure that those are accessible, those are actually where people go, and that the communities that need to access that are actually weighing in on the decision of where to place those.
Now, you've spoken to a group of local leaders in the last couple of weeks. I mean, do you think that they are prepared and they are excited, or you find that there is a lack or gap of knowledge there?
I think it's varied, right? I think that most people understand, and when the impact and the importance of the census is laid out, people are like, whoa, and then you realize, okay, we've got less than a year to go, and then the eyes get even wider, and that urgency starts to set in. So I think, you've got definitely a variance in how prepared different states or municipalities are right now, and part of that is due to state or local resources. Some of that is due to state or local political will. And a lot of the members, our State Count Action Network, which is now in over 30 states, where local and state partners are coordinating state tables and coordinating the advocacy and the Get Out the Count efforts that will take place in that state. Those folks have been working with their state legislators, with their local city council members and their mayors to encourage and advocate for the state and local funding that will be necessary to ensure a fair and accurate count, particularly for those to reach those communities that are deemed hard to count. I think there are a couple of different buckets of preparation, I would say. There's, states like California, which it was mentioned previously, have designated over $90 million for census funding, and now are distributing that across the cities and across the various community groups and community organizations. Then you have states like Georgia, we just found out, which designated $1.5 million and set up a complete count committee, and is starting to work with those local partners. Very different states, and obviously different level of engagement and participation that's going to be necessary. And then there's some states which, due to the climate or resources available, are really focusing on the local local engagement. So the city of San Antonio and Belhar County just partnered to set up a complete count committee in their area today, and so that's really exciting. So it's really about working now to get prepared, because it's a very complicated undertaking, and we're happy to help provide any resources to be helpful to folks.
Thank you, Beth. Gary, the previous panel referred to making sure that everybody is engaged in this process with local leaders, whether it is the faith-based community, the philanthropic community. What are you seeing from the philanthropic communities as interest in supporting local communities to help get an accurate account?
Well, I got to say, in reference to the first panel, there were so many challenges. As I was walking up, I was hoping they would walk out and go, April Fools. I guess you can look at it that someone in government years ago must have had a sense of humor to have Census Day on April 1. But be that as it may, funders have enormous amount at stake. As many of you in the room know, the philanthropic community may actually use the census data in considering how to do grant making. That is, it looks at the data and allocates appropriately. On top of it, what we're mostly concerned about is our grantees, who are involved in all kinds of community activities, whether at the local level involved in service delivery or at a national level or even state level doing research. You know, virtually every grantee in one way or another touches on either the census data or the derivation of the census data that was talked about in the last panel. On top of it, many funders partner with government, and they will do that in the form of various kinds of service delivery. So if the census data is wrong, Clarence, this sets up a whole dynamic about service delivery in the wrong locations. Think about it in terms of planning for schools. If you have the numbers wrong, virtually everything you do is going to be wrong. And of course, from a funder perspective, many funders care about democracy. And we talked about in the last panel, if you will, there are three pillars of democracy: voting, census, and redistricting. You get any one of those pillars wrong, and you've distorted democracy, if not for that year, then for the next decade. So from a funder's perspective, getting this right is absolutely essential. And I do think, Clarence, that there is a very big difference from 2010 cycle to this cycle for the philanthropic community. I mean, first of all, I think the scope and the intensity this time is much, much more extensive. I'm chairing a funder collaborative, and it is remarkable. There are probably about 100 national funders that are engaged in supporting census. Census. Let me remind you all. It's not like the foundation community or any foundation has a portfolio called census. And yet, somehow, they're really understanding this. And I think it really comes down to some of the conversation from the first panel about concerns that are happening. I do want to say that we did start as funders. In your comment, we did start early enough in 2015 to come up with a plan of action. And you heard the comment in the last panel that they haven't seen as much news attention and they haven't seen as much action. I heard that from the Census Bureau. And you should all know that did not happen by accident. It was the funding that the philanthropic community put together starting in 2015 with a strategy that enabled groups to be working on the subject. What we did is we had a plan that had three parts to it. The first was to support the national organizations and state groups who could work on policy fronts. So everything that you talked about in the last panel around funding for census or issues around the citizenship question or the questions that didn't make it to the census, the revised questions, that whole policy front. The second kind of bucket of work was what we're all calling Get Out the Count, which for the philanthropic community is targeting hard-to-count communities that was talked about. And the third kind of bucket of work was to bring new audiences to the table. And that was everything from the faith-based community that Beth just talked about, all the way to state and local governments, to a whole range of other players like the business community. So that was really the first thing, Clarence. I do think an important piece to keep in mind from the last panel, there was a survey question that the Census Bureau asked that didn't come out in the last panel. It was asked around the same point at this time frame for the 2010 cycle. It was asked of people, how likely are you to fill out the census? And about 87% of the public said they would be ready to fill it out. In this cycle, while the wording was slightly different, it was down around 65%. You know, we're not only dealing with the politics, the political climate, but there's also survey fatigue. You know, it's just people are tired. Plus, what is really missing in all this is simply the distrust of government. You know, and until we can focus in on trusted messengers and really identify how to get to that audience, we're going to have a heck of a problem in getting a fair and accurate census.
So, you know, like Beth asked, are there any examples, if you will? You talked about LA and California, Georgia, and other communities. Could you give us, Gary, any examples where you see philanthropic local communities partnering to do this the right way, that if our city leaders at the National League of Cities want to reach out to a city or a philanthropic community, where would they go, as an example?
Well, Clarence, I've got to start with state level first.
Okay.
You know, I don't think many folks are ready to engage at the city level the way you're thinking. And I think Beth gave us an incredibly important warning, which is you got to move now in order to do this. I mean, there are a lot of steps in the process of getting a real plan together. You know, for us as the funders, what we're starting to encourage people to think about is sort of a three-part process for getting to this. The first is really starting to define the target population. A lot of groups who are going to be working on census are going to be coming out of the voting space. You know, mostly the nonpartisan get out the vote kind of crowd. Well, unfortunately, it is not directly analogous, right? You know, the hard to count community may not even be eligible to vote, so they're not going to be part of voter files. So you can't simply go take the local voter file and target in on that and just say, oh, I'm going to focus on low propensity voters. You've got to do something much more extensive, much more thoughtful as a strategy around defining that local target. The second thing that we're encouraging people to do is start thinking about how do you reach that target. And while we talked about the concerns of a digital census, we should also be talking about the opportunities it presents for doing outreach in ways that we've never been able to do. For example, you know, how can we start using SMS, you know, text messaging technologies? How can we use social media? How can we design things that are more cell-oriented, since many of the low-income income communities and people of color that fit the hard-to-count model do have? On top of it, how do we use analytics to better monitor the outreach efforts and how successful we are? And then how do we use that data gathering to build something that's stronger and more robust than simply addressing census, but builds a civic engagement community? The third thing, beyond identifying the target audience, Clarence, and also the how do you reach the audience, I think the third thing is we need to start thinking about the ask of the community and timing it on the basis of what the Census Bureau is telling us. For example, between now and January, we have to really launch an education and awareness campaign to make people aware of the census. Come January, from January through March, you got to remember that in January, the census forms are going to be sent out in Alaska, and early in March, it's going to be sent out to all the rest of us. What we need to do between that period is start a promotion campaign that starts promoting folks and saying, fill out the census. And then from May through July, we have to do the mobilization to ensure that those that didn't fill out in the first round, didn't self-respond, we target in on that audience and make sure they fill out the census. That's the kind of strategy I think local communities are going to have to figure out. And, I can tell you, if you want me to keep going, I can take a break, some examples of state efforts.
Yeah.
I think there are great efforts going on.
Yeah.
So, Beth, I can tell that you really want to jump in on the hard-to-count population in communities. I know the leadership conferences, it consists of a diverse constituents. So what strategies or examples would you recommend to cities that could go into the minority communities and to access them to make them want to vote? I mean, not vote, be counted.
Counted.
I'm a former mayor, so everything's voting.
So yes, I mean, I think that there's a number of things that people can be doing now in terms of planning and how they're reaching hard to count communities. The first thing I would suggest is make sure that you're speaking in terms and using messages that really resonate with those communities. The Funders Census Initiative and many of the partners of the Census Counts campaign did message testing over the past 6 months or so, and presented those results, and those are available to anyone to use and utilize. And there's some really interesting and important findings in that. One is, some things that are less intuitive, talking about the census as a form of as a political action doesn't really resonate in the middle of the country, and isn't something that really pulls or draws people in. It's really about, okay, what's in it for me? This is about schools, healthcare, education, and so really looking at it that way. And then also there's for looking at particular communities. So the Latino community, for example, prefers to fill out a written form. So that's based on research that NALEO Educational Fund did, and so that is helpful as you're thinking about your outreach, because it has to come, from the community and from your listening and your work with your community members. The second thing that I would say is, to Gary's point, I cannot stress or overstress the need for engaging trusted messengers. One of the good things about, or one of the many good things about the philanthropic community and then the nonprofit community really getting organized so early in the cycle this time around, is that many states have state tables of groups that are ready to go, so to speak, or prepping and planning for their Get Out the Count efforts. And so those are great partners for you to engage with as you're building out your plans and thinking about, how should we be building our outreach? What events should we be going to? What are the biggest barriers to awareness and education? We also want to ensure that people are utilizing your own voice in your space. So one of the findings out of that message research is that generally elected leaders are not as trusted of a messenger, with the exception of local leaders, so mayors and council members. Right. So use that voice and engage and educate that community. And then I would the last thing I'll just say is really encourage all of your outreach efforts to be representative. So if you're planning a engagement on or you're filling out a complete count committee or commission in your city or your county or your area, make sure that you have the representation of the relevant hard to count groups. If you haven't checked out, the CUNY has a great map that maps hard to count communities, and it goes down to the city level, the county level, and you can pull out to see, okay, what are the highest percentages of hard to count communities in my city, so that as you're planning that effort, you're engaging those folks and hopefully bringing those folks to the table as you're building out your infrastructure.
So, question for both of you. I mean, you've described to us this complex process and partnership. How do we make sure it works so that it's no limited duplication, and that it's not an overburden, if you will, to residents getting all of these messages from these different partners. Gary, you got some thoughts on that to see how we can coordinate the national, state, as well as with the local leaders? Because I feel like it become overwhelming. Yeah. Okay.
No, it is overwhelming because it's an overwhelming task, and we have to break it apart into smaller pieces so we can achieve it. And I think there are models within states where we're starting to see the partnership work well. I was thinking of the state of Michigan, for example, where you've got the groups in the state and the funders came together to work with policymakers to get legislation passed in the state that then provided a matching-based fund for census work. And what the groups and the funders did is they came together and came up with a statewide plan of action and then raised the money that served as a match. And they are now working regionally within the state with local community foundations in United Ways to help them do mini grants to work with the cities and local areas in Michigan. So there are lots of examples. I think there are probably 3 steps I would take. One is everyone in this room should stay in touch with Beth. That's one. Get her email. And I think the second is stay in touch with the National League of Cities. You have a toolkit that is incredibly powerful. Oh, you brought her. Okay, there you go. Show and tell. I've gone through it. It's incredibly useful. It's very much the very practical kinds of steps. And then I think if you're looking for partnerships, I think there are other kinds of associations that work with mayors across the country, groups like Cities of Service. And I would say those 3 kinds of approaches will get you there.
Yeah, I would echo a lot of those points and just say I think coordination cannot be overstressed. So that's one of the benefits of a complete count commission and complete count committee in your city or state is that it's a coordinating entity to make sure that there aren't necessarily redundancies, and also communicating with your in-state tables in states. The last thing I want to mention is work with partners on the ground to engage not only their spaces but also their communities. We know, so today is our 1 year out from Census Day in 2020, and across the country, organizations are putting on over 50 events, engaging and educating communities on Twitter, and really jump-starting their educational efforts in earnest. So plug into those efforts. That this won't be the last major engagement point. There will be many, many more. And so we at the Census Counts campaign, but also all of our members and partners who are some of whom are in the room right now, I really encourage you to engage and connect with those folks in your community and in your city and in your state.
Thank you. Now we'll open it up to the audience and see if we have any questions. We have one here. And
thank you very much. Very interesting. I just came up with a brainstorm, and maybe somebody's already thought about this. But I've seen this happen in communities before. What about getting trusted local leaders to do census questionnaire parties where you get people together? And especially in the Hispanic and African American communities, I've seen this happen. And I hate to be, gender-based here. It's the women who are the most powerful. Thank you. Yeah. Now, I'm ready to hand the world over to women, by the way. But no, I really think that would be a great way, because there's a lot of fear about filling out these forms. But when you do it in a group situation, even if it's 20 or 30 people at a time, you get enough of those and you'll get your count.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great idea. There are a couple things I would tack on to that. Let's build on that concept and talk about a sort of faith-based Sunday for census, where we talk about it in the churches and other houses of worship. Why not have other kinds of events that are community-based at, say, the community health center that has the mobile van moving around? To your point, I think what we can do is encourage the head of the household to fill out the census. We've got to remember, this isn't about just going to anybody and saying, fill out the census. The census is filled out by the head of the household. That's another example where it's not analogous to voting strategies. But I think your idea is a great one. Add to it, why not also have census pledges? Where we could be having go to door, encourage people to fill out a pledge, and then have, using newer technology, remind them periodically about the pledge. Mm-hmm. The last thing I would comment about your example is, in different communities of color, the notion of family and friends is incredibly powerful. Yeah. And the whole notion of doing digital relational organizing could be a very powerful strategy for tackling the census. The challenge to it is we have to overcome the citizenship question right now. And the last vestiges, even if it's removed by the Supreme Court, it has left a really very big hurdle to get over.
And I would just add to that is that I think that is a great point. And the online option this go round creates another opportunity that you can literally do it anywhere. So it's, hey, we're waiting in line at a sporting event. Here's make sure folks, if you're head of household, filling out your census form, or at a church. And this is something that groups are thinking about and planning around as well. But I think that is a really critical point. The last thing I would just add is that Vanita mentioned on the previous panel that a lot of around the citizenship question, there's a lot of fear in communities, and a lot of the damage has already been done. And so when Gary was talking about kind of those three phases of the campaign and where we are right now is education and awareness, one big thing about the Census Day of Action today has been focused on educating people about the importance of the census. For many people, one of the only things they've heard about the census, or that has broken through the clutter for them, is the citizenship question. And we have to really educate people about, this is why the census matters to you, to your life, to your community, and really educating people. So as you're thinking about those kinds of house party ideas or convenings, think about what we can do between now and October, or now and January, to maybe it's an educational party, or talking about educating people and having just a conversation about, okay, what are you afraid of? Okay, here's the truth that census data is protected. We know there's a lot of uncertainty in the world right now, but this participating in the census is incredibly critical for your participation, and then just listening. So I think that it's really critical to have some of those conversations early before we get into the get out the count phase.
Question. Any other questions? I'm not in charge. You give it to whoever you're in charge. I just asked. Yes.
Could you just clarify what is the mandate of the census in terms of who is to be counted? What about Americans living overseas? Mm-hmm. My next door neighbor who works for the World Bank, not American citizen, has kids who are born in the United States, all sorts of categories like that.
Yeah, so the Constitution states that every person, regardless of citizenship status, should fill out the census. And it also does include people living in group quarters or people who are overseas serving. The Census Bureau has processes to count those people.
Next question. We're going to be real quick in responding to your questions.
Thank you. Am I correct that there was a test run in Rhode Island again this year? Can you give us any feedback on what did and didn't work and how the technology is faring in this round?
So there was a end-to-end test, which it's important to say, it was an end-to-end test because usually, and if the Census Bureau had had the funding that they needed, it would have been a full dress rehearsal, but they had to shift it due to some insufficient funding. The end-to-end test in Rhode Island did employ, some of the digital tools, and the Census Bureau would say, that they found out, okay, having those that technology for all the doors is really critical, et cetera. The other thing that happened was right before that test started, the citizenship question was put on the form, and so there was a lot of fear in communities, but also there was a lot of confusion of what that meant, and so that was a really critical point as well.
Just 2 seconds worth. GAO still puts it on the high risk even after that.
Yeah.
Next question.
Hi, Beth. Joe from CHN. One of the biggest problems with the undercount, as we learned in the first panel, is that the biggest undercount population is children under 5. And one of the biggest issues is that those children who are undercounted, 4 out of 5 of them were actually in households that responded to the census. Could you guys talk about the importance of filling out and how it's filled out and who gets counted as a part of a, quote, household?
You can start.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So, yes, you're absolutely right that that the highest age group that was undercounted was children under 5, and many of those folks were in households that were counted. That is why, from the stakeholder community and advocates, it is so critical that we're talking to people about the importance of the census and counting everyone in your household. It's the head of household that fills out the form. There's a number of hypotheses about why that undercount happened in the way that Joe laid out. One is that there's some kind of mixed households, so intergenerational households, and so you didn't count the youngest children in the household, or some kind of transitory pieces, or some people just didn't count young kids. And so talking about how important it is that everyone in your household is counted, it means, when they're of age, this is going to span 10 years. So when they're of age, making sure that their schools are properly resourced, that they have the books that they need. So that's why in some of those roundtable conversations or house party conversations, specifically speaking to the importance of the undercount or of counting young children and children under 5 is really important.
2 really fast points. One, to add to the situation, Bill, you didn't mention that a lot of people of color are going to be new to the census, that you were citing the numbers, but you're going to have a lot of new populations that have never filled out a census. The second is that there's new research coming out of the Population Reference Bureau that another demographer, Bill O'Hare, and another set of authors just put out and said, good example, you can't just take the model of hard to count and apply it to 0 through 5 or through 4. That there are other factors that work better as predictor of a net undercount. That's the kind of detailed work that we're all going to have to look at.
Okay, last question.
Hi. So you were talking about the government, right here. You were talking about distrust toward the government and how that's going to affect the census. Information is power, and political leaders might not want to give that kind of power to the federal government. Can you talk about your experience and knowledge about state and county political leaders and their feelings about allowing the census to come in and do that on-the-ground work in their communities?
I'll let you guys. I'm moderating today. Go ahead. It's hard, but I am. Go ahead.
Well, you are absolutely right that political power is not something given up easily in any environment. If I were preaching, I would want to preach that the census is nonpartisan and that we're all in it together. And I think what's happened in this environment is too many other voices have politicized it and has made it very challenging for all of us. So that's how I would answer you. We can talk about how to deal with it at any local level and how to balance those things, but I think we've got to first and foremost talk about we're in the boat together.
I'll just add that, most mayors, council members don't care what party you're in. They just want their citizens to be counted. And I hope that with all the information that's been provided today, that you remain optimistic that we can do it and we can make sure that every American is counted, and that this is just not a technical exercise. This is a real democratic opportunity to participate in an American process that really means something. It is just not a technical exercise. And I'm going to close. I think Cheryl made a Hamilton reference. I don't want us to throw away our shot. This is our shot. And I'm mature now in age, so 10 years from now, I want another count, I hope. But this one here is so important. Every one is important, but this is the 24th one, I think. And I tell you, it's something special about this that every American should be counted. And we need to, in this room, leave here within a month, go to our local leaders and ask, what are you doing? And I will tell you, they're going to tell you what they're doing. So let's get counted. Don't throw away our shot. Andy, why don't you come to close?
I'll come. Well, you kind of did it, Clarence. That was great. Yeah,
Alan, I'm sorry.
Superfluous in a way. Hey, I'm Alan from the Metro program. I did want to share on that political note a breaking tweet from President Trump. He quote. My earlier tweet was ill-advised, and I regret misleading the American public as to the value of the 2020 census. I hope everyone participates. I'm really sorry about this whole citizenship question thing.
Thank you.
So,
Thank
yeah.
Thank you, Alan.
April Fools. Yeah, sorry. Couldn't resist. Look, you all don't need, I think Clarence said it very well, folks in this room don't need a reminder from the president or anybody else about why this is important. I think we got really clear reminders of that from both of our panels today, and especially from this great second panel about what we can do at the national and the local levels to promote a complete, fair, and accurate 2020 census. One thing that I think is worth emphasizing, the conversation didn't quite capture, is that Bill Fry and I rely on good census data every single day in our jobs. So I encourage you to make everyone count just so we have some value to the world to provide. I'm really grateful to all of our expert panelists today, to Clarence, our great partners at the National League of Cities Institute. Hold up the action kit again. This is a great tool. There might be copies outside. Go online and look at it. Share it with your friends. Share it in your communities. It's just a really great resource. And thank you as well to Cheryl for your leadership locally in New York and then nationally here at Brookings on these issues. Thank you all for being here today. Go forth and be counted.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.